There's a week to go in the NHL regular season, and man, is that last playoff spot in the Eastern Conference a mess.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Locked On NHL Power Rankings. I am Nick Zararis, one of the co-hosts of Locked On Flames. That is my co-host Hunter Hodes, one of the co-hosts of Locked On Penguins. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Indeed. Indeed knows when you're growing your business, you have to make every dollar count. That's why with Indeed, you only pay for quality applications that match your must-have job requirements. Visit Indeed.com/locked-on to start hiring now. Terms and conditions do apply. On today's show, we are going to touch on the power rankings themselves as voted on by the Locked On NHL Network podcast hosts. We are going to discuss the absolute mess that is that last playoff spot in the Eastern Conference, where there are 5 teams vying for 1.5 spots because the Islanders have kind of given themselves a little breathing room in the third spot in the Metropolitan Division. And then in the third segment, we're going to just talk about the playoff format at large, because there's a growing discontent amongst the public, the general confusion about this format, where a good chunk of the population does not understand who plays who because this format is so convoluted, and just it's kind of unfair. But pulling back into the big picture, talking about the power rankings themselves, when you look at them, it feels interesting to see the Rangers and the Hurricanes ahead of both the Panthers and the Bruins, because most of the season, the Panthers have been the consensus best team in the East, but I guess their recent form in conjunction with the Rangers and the Hurricanes' recent form, and then I guess a lot of people are skeptical of Boston like I am, and that's kind of the driving force for the Rangers and Canes being 1-2.
Yeah, I would say so. I think, when I look at the top 4, especially in this conference, we'll get to 5 and 8 in just a second. I mean, I'm not surprised that the Rangers are at number 1. I mean, they have the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference right now. And I do think they are going to get that number 1 seed by the end of the season. I know the Panthers have struggled quite a bit as of late, but I still am going to die on the hill that they are at least the second best team in the conference when they are humming. I think Bobrovsky is going to give them the goaltending in the playoffs. You're going to see Tkachuk and Barkov do their thing in the playoffs as well, plus Sam Reinhart and Aaron Ekblad, et cetera, et cetera. I do think when they are humming overall, they are the best overall team in the conference, but they just haven't been playing like it throughout the last several weeks. I think right now, even though Carolina is ahead of them in the standings, I would still put Florida number 2. And even though also when you look at the standings, Florida is 3 points behind the Boston Bruins as well. Otherwise, I'm not too upset by this top 4 at all. I mean, you look at 5 through 8, the Maple Leafs, Lightning, Islanders, Penguins. That's totally fine. I know the Capitals do have that final playoff spot heading into tonight's games, Nick, but when I look at the teams fighting for that last playoff spot in the Eastern Conference, and we can even say the last 2 playoff spots, even though the Islanders looks like likely right now that they probably will get in, but we'll have to see how this final week goes. But when I look at the teams fighting for that second wildcard spot, I do think the Penguins are better than all those other teams, and they have been playing like it throughout the last couple of weeks. They just have to finish strongly and hope that Washington stumbles a little bit down the stretch.
Yeah, and we'll get more in depth talking about the Islanders, the Penguins, Washington, Detroit, and Philadelphia, who are all still vying for those last 2 playoff spots. But still, we're at a point now where we've got 6 of the 8 in the East locked up, and then pretty much everybody in the West is more or less resolved. It's just a matter of seeding at that point. I know the Jets have kind of struggled down the stretch at points. The Jets have been the number 1 team in the power rankings in the entire league. They have been first in the Central a number of times, but Dallas and Colorado really rounding into form down the stretch. Vancouver, I know Thatcher Demko working his way back from injury. That's kind of a cause for concern to some degree. Vegas getting healthy. They're starting to integrate a lot of new pieces. Nashville kind of stumbling as of late, but still relatively competitive. But at this point, it's all about seeding out West.
Agreed. I mean, if you want to say that there's a small fight for that last playoff spot, you could maybe make a small argument with that, Nick. But when you look at the standings right now, Vegas 78 games, 42, 28, and 8 for 92 points. The Blues are only 3 points back, but the Knights have a game in hand on them. The Blues basically have to win their final 3 games and then kind of hope that the Knights just lose out if they want to sneak their way into the playoffs. I mean, the Knights really only have to win one of their final 4 games and then get a loser point in the other game to just clinch their way into the playoffs. So again, small little fight for that final playoff spot, but not really at the same time. I think we're just looking, as you said, for seeding. And I mean, it feels like we're going back and forth with who gets third in the Pacific versus who gets that second wild card spot and avoids playing the Edmonton Oilers, it looks like right now. I mean, sure, the Oilers do have at least an outside shot at winning the Pacific. I mean, they have 2 games in hand on the Canucks. They're 4 points back. So if they win those 2 games, they'll be tied with the Canucks. But I still think the Canucks are going to be able to hold on to that top spot in the Pacific. But seeing who plays Edmonton in the first round is going to be really fascinating to me, because it looks like one week it's going to be Vegas, then it's going to be LA, then it goes back and forth. But, you know, if I'm Edmonton, I'm probably rooting to play LA in the playoffs just because of the way Edmonton has played LA the past couple of years.
Yeah, it's why we're going to talk about this playoff format being convoluted in the third segment of today's episode, because there's a real argument you might be better off trying to play Vancouver than playing Edmonton in round 1, in all honesty, because of Edmonton's recent success against the Kings in the postseason, the Canucks' relative lack of playoff experience, and just not wanting to run it back a third straight time, because we've seen this story a couple different times where the Oilers have kind of pulled away over the course of a long series because of their star power. But circling back, drop to the big picture, it feels like that top tier of teams is Dallas, Colorado, maybe the Rangers, maybe the Panthers. And then we go down into that next tier of teams where we're talking about Carolina, the Bruins, the Leafs, the Canucks, the Oilers. You can throw the Jets in there. And then there are a few teams like Vegas, like Tampa Bay, where I don't really know where to put them, because if they're locked in and playing at their best, I think there's an argument Vegas could win the whole thing. I don't think Tampa Bay is capable of winning the whole thing, just how shallow they are depth-wise. But they've got enough talent where if they made the Eastern Conference final and dragged it out to 6 or 7 games, I wouldn't be shocked. I mean, Kucherov's playing like one of the 5 best players in the world right now, and their power play is humming. They have the best power play in the entire league this season, and that's really all they've got. You know, Brandon Hagel's a solid player. They've got some decent middle 6 guys, but nothing like they had when they were winning the Stanley Cups. But the pedigree and the ability of their star players to rise to the occasion, it gives you pause.
Agreed. I mean, I've been saying on this show with you for the past couple of weeks now, I mean, if I were a fan of any of the top seeds in the Eastern Conference, I would not want to draw Tampa Bay in the first round. That is going to be a really hard series to win, just based on what you said overall, the power play. And I was at that game last Saturday when the Penguins blew that 4-1 lead to Tampa. I was never comfortable heading into the third period just because I know how potent Tampa can be offensively, especially on the power play. Every time they got a power play, I was just flat out nervous, just because the way they move the puck on the man advantage is unlike honestly anything in the NHL. I mean, I know what McDavid and Draisaitl and Bouchard and them can do with Oilers power play, but Tampa's power play is just that much better. Sure, their 5-on-5 metrics aren't the greatest when you stack them up to other teams in the league, but it's still good enough where you combine that with their lethal power play, they're going to be a really hard out. And Nick, with Vasilevsky returning to form, beating him 4 out of 7 times, that's still going to be a tall task. So again, I don't think they're going to win it all either, but if they were to win a round or 2, I don't think anyone would be shocked just based on the way they've been playing down the stretch for the most part.
And there you have it. 2 very analytically inclined people at the end of the day, still fearing Tampa Bay because they've done it. You know,
yes,
it's very easy to fall back on these narratives and these tropes, but Tampa Bay has been one of the defining teams of the entire NHL over the last decade. You know, they've made several conference finals. They've made several Stanley Cup finals all the way back to 2014-15. And they have been one of the teams that has always managed to find a way. And that's one of the defining traits of a great team, is finding a way no matter how difficult the circumstances are. But before we dive into the mess that is the final two playoff spots in the Eastern Conference, we are going to take a quick break. You're probably trying to lean out for summer. You want to look good when you go to the beach. Eat stress-free this spring with Factor's delicious ready-to-eat meals. Every fresh, never frozen meal is chef-crafted, dietitian-approved, and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from weekly menu options, including Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, Vegan, or Veggie. Discover more than 60 add-ons every week, like breakfast, lunch, snacks, and beverages to stay fueled and feel good all day long. What are you waiting for? Get started and fuel up your springtime goals. You don't want to order takeout every single night. Get chef-prepared meals on the table in 2 minutes or less with Factor's ready-to-eat meals so you can get back to doing what you love this spring. Looking for high-quality meals? Try the feature premium ingredients like filet mignon, shrimp, truffle butter, broccolini, and asparagus. No fuss, no mess. There's no prep, cooking, or cleaning up. Just heat it up and savor the good stuff. Customize your weekly meals with flexibility to get as much or as little as you need. Pause or reschedule to suit your lifestyle. We're celebrating Earth Day all month. Look out for the Earth Month Eats badge on the menu for our lowest carbon footprint meals. Head to factormeals.com/LockedOnNHL50 and use code LockedOnNHL50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next box. That's code LockedOnNHL50 at factormeals.com/LockedOnNHL to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next box while your subscription is active. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hunter, let's break it down for the people. The Islanders have played 78 games. They have 87 points. The Washington Capitals have played 78 games. They have 85 points. The Pittsburgh Penguins have played 78 games. They have 84 points. The Detroit Red Wings have played 78 games. They have 84 points. The Philadelphia Flyers have played 79 games. They have 83 points. We are talking about 5 teams separated by 4 points for 2 spots. Some of these teams have 3 games remaining. Some of these teams have 4 games remaining, and we're going to talk about the schedules in a minute. But we've talked about this a lot this season. None of these teams is particularly good or even interesting, in all honesty. You know, the Penguins' recent form is arguably the best any of these teams has played all season. Maybe that 6-game stretch where the Islanders won 6 in a row in early March maybe could contest with that, but none of these teams has played particularly compelling hockey.
I mean, the Islanders have won 5 in a row. They've won 7 of their last 10, Nick, but I don't think they've looked as good as the Penguins have over the last 9 games. I mean, I was watching that Islanders game versus the Rangers, and Islanders played a great first period against them, jumped out to a 3-0 lead, and then the Rangers just took it to them in the final 40 minutes. I think the only reason why the Islanders won that game is because of Semyon Varlamov, who has outplayed Ilya Sorokin for this entire season. And hey, I didn't know that Varlamov has turned into 2009 Semyon Varlamov, but here we are 15 years later. He's playing like one of the best goaltenders in hockey, especially over this last week or change. And, you know, when you look at the Penguins, I just hope it's not too late for them, because if they had played like this earlier in the season, they would not be needing to basically win out to get into the playoffs. It's just crazy that it's taken this long for them to look this consistent game in and game out. They have been so mentally fragile all year up until these last 7 or 8 games where when something goes wrong, they're able to push back and at least get a point, if not win the game. Heck, they won 4 in a row before that was snapped by the Maple Leafs the other night just because the Penguins can't ever win in overtime. The Capitals, that team honestly amazed me that they are in this spot right now. A minus 40 goal differential. They have 3 pretty good forwards, John Carlson on the back end, and a hot goaltender. That's it. That is their entire team this year, Nick. Alex Ovechkin, we all know, Russian machine never breaks. He had not even 10 goals at the halfway point of the season. He has another 30-goal campaign just because how insane he is at that NHL level. Dylan Strome has been great. I already discussed Tom Wilson and John Carlson, but Charlie Lindgren, he has been a godsend for that team all year. And I know it's going to make a lot of people mad if they get in, probably me, because considering I host I'm one of the hosts of the Locked On Penguins podcast, but you're going to have to also respect it just based on the level that Lindgren has played at throughout the season. And for the Flyers, it feels like to me, Nick, yes, they're in the race, but it feels like they're out of gas. These last 6 to 7 games, they just really haven't had it at all. I mean, people I know are arguing that, oh, they're quitting on John Tortorella. This is what happens to a Torts team late in the season. But I don't know if I see it that way. I think they've played above their level for basically this entire season. And when they got this close, I think they just ran out of gas. And you're seeing what's been happening over the last couple of weeks. I mean, they had a pretty easy set of games into the playoffs with playing a lot of bad teams, and they've been getting crushed night in and night out because they just haven't had it. And it doesn't get any easier tonight when they play the Rangers at MSG. I think with a loss tonight in regulation and potentially a Penguins win against the Red Wings, the Flyers are officially all but dead in the water, even though I think heading into this game, I think they're basically cooked anyway.
I was in Philly over the weekend, and I was talking to one of the bartenders at Xfinity Live about the Flyers, and what he said, I found oddly prescient and actually really smart. I think to sum it up, because this was like a 20-minute conversation, his point was that whoever you're putting the blame on with the Flyers is who you came into the season not believing in. If you think it's Tortorella's fault, you didn't trust Tortorella coming into the season. If you think the players are folding, you didn't think the roster was talented enough, or Danny Briere shouldn't have traded Sean Walker at the trade deadline. If you think it's the front office's fault, you think they didn't commit to blowing the team up enough. So no matter who you're putting the blame on, there's plenty of blame to go around here. It's not just one of those things. I think all 3 of those things can be true. I think Torts has a very abrasive style. I think the history and his track record post Tampa Bay shows that he's good for about 3 seasons. He's good for a young team to kind of get them to understand how to be professionals. But once they get to that threshold, it wears thin on you constantly being berated and practiced hard, even though you know what you're doing. You're in the NHL. I think there's a real argument that they should have traded more guys from the roster if they were going to commit to being bad, or if they were going to try and stay in the mix. They shouldn't have traded somebody like Sean Walker, and they should have tried to make something work. So looking at the schedules, the Red Wings have the Penguins, which is tonight. That's de facto elimination game where if the Red Wings lose, that puts real separation between them and the Penguins. The Red Wings then play the Leafs, and then they have the Habs back-to-back. I would argue the Red Wings probably have the easiest schedule of the teams in this conversation. The Penguins have Detroit, the Bruins, who may or may not have something to play for, the Predators, who may or may not have something to play for, and the Islanders, who may or may not have something to play for. The Islanders have Montreal, which is tonight. They have the Rangers on Saturday. They have the Devils, and then the Penguins. That Islanders-Penguins game to close the season, the last day of the season on the 18th, may or may not be a de facto play-in game. Then Washington has Buffalo, which is tonight. They have Tampa Bay, they have Boston, and then they have Philly. Those are difficult, man. Washington's probably got the hardest of these 4, and I would say Detroit's probably got the easiest of these 4 just because they get 2 games against Montreal, who's, I don't want to say they've packed it in, but Montreal's not a good team. Whereas Pittsburgh, Boston probably is playing for first place in the East. Nashville wants to be sure in their playoff spot, and the Islanders are probably going to be playing to try and get in the playoffs on that last day. So It's not easy. None of these schedules are easy other than other than Detroit's, and even that's not easy. But the thing I think about this situation, because some of these teams are directly playing each other, it'll sort itself out very quickly. Detroit loses tonight, they might be cooked for the season. Same thing with Pittsburgh. They lose tonight, they might be cooked for the season.
Yeah, I mean, have you seen the money puck odds for tonight, Nick? I mean, the Penguins win in regulation, their playoff odds are 60%. If they lose in regulation, they're below 20%. So you're right. This basically is an elimination game. It honestly reminds me of, say you're tied 2-2 in a series, and this is game 5. And usually whoever wins game 5 goes on to win the series a good chunk of the time. So
it's like 60-something%.
Yeah. That's kind of what this reminds me of a little bit for tonight. And you also have to remember this, Nick. The Penguins have the tiebreaker over all of these teams right now. Regulation wins is the tiebreaker in this conference. Right now, the Red Wings have 27 regulation wins. The Penguins have 31. So if they tie the Penguins at the end of the season, they have to hope that they win out and then the Penguins lose out because they have the regulation overtime wins as the next one. So the Penguins, they have the tiebreaker over them. They also have the tiebreaker over the Flyers with 31 regulation wins over 28. And then Washington, they have 29 regulation wins. Pittsburgh has 31. As long as the Penguins win 2 of their last 4 games and tie Washington or any of these teams overall, they get in because they have the tiebreaker. I just wanted to put that out there overall. But I mean, man, this is going to be a crazy finish. If you had to predict who gets these final 2 spots just to end the segment, who are you going with?
Probably Pittsburgh and probably the Islanders. I don't feel strongly about either of those. The Islanders have themselves a little bit of a cushion where they can probably afford to lose 1 game of their final 4 and still get in. But Detroit inspires little confidence. Philadelphia inspires basically none. And Washington is just not a good hockey team. I know where they are in the standings, but I don't think they're particularly good. Real quick, your 2 playoff teams, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the format.
Right. I mean, yeah, Washington is not good at all. I mean, their metrics are bad. They have a minus 40 goal differential. I already discussed the roster at hand. I'm going to go with the Islanders to get in. And God, I hope I don't get old takes exposed. I've been going back and forth for a while. I am going to go with Pittsburgh to sneak their way in throughout the next week.
I can see it, and we will be right back. When you're drafting your fantasy team, don't you wish you could pick the all-stars for your team? If you're building your talent roster, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills when you can do it all with Indeed. Find top talent fast with Indeed's suite of powerful hiring tools like matching, assessments, and virtual interviews. Hate waiting? Indeed's U.S. data shows over 80% of Indeed employers find quality candidates whose resume on Indeed matches their job description the moment they sponsor a job. Something I love about Indeed is that everything's all in one place. You can take assessments, set up interviews, and conduct the interviews themselves. With Indeed, matching as soon as you sponsor a post, you get a short list of quality candidates whose resume on Indeed match your job description, and it's hiring at warp speed. Indeed knows when you're growing your business, you have to make every dollar count. That's why with Indeed, you only pay for quality applicants that match your must-have job requirements. Visit Indeed.com/lockedon to start hiring now. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon. Indeed.com/locked-on. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Want to thank everybody who's hanging out with us on this Thursday edition of the Locked On NHL Power Rankings. Hunter, this playoff format stinks.
There's no better way to say it, Nick. This thing has been terrible ever since it was brought in all those years ago. I can't stand it. It pits first round matchups that should be second round matchups. It pits first round matchups that also should be conference final matchups. I am a believer in the 1 versus 8 system, and they never should have went away from it. I hate this format.
It is the biggest indictment I have of this format, and it's very straightforward. It is too confusing for the average fan. I read Pierre LeBrun's column in The Athletic the other day where he talked to a few different team presidents, a couple general managers about their feelings of it. And that was the recurring theme. A lot of the general managers and presidents said their people in their day-to-day lives did not understand the format because the way the wild cards are set up, if you don't have the full standings in front of you, you don't know who's in what spot. The 3 in each division, sure, that's perfectly straightforward, makes easy sense. The issue is if you don't have the standings in front of you, you don't know who's in what spot because the division alignment means if you have, 80, you have like 90 points like Tampa Bay does. If you were in the Metro, you would be in that third playoff spot, which in theory, because you're a better seed, a better team, you would think you would get a better seed. You would get, in theory, a more favorable matchup. But because of this format, which was designed to reinvigorate divisional rivalries, but the issue with that, and the general managers in Pierre's column mentioned this, nobody plays a division-heavy schedule anymore. This isn't like back in the day where you would play the same teams in your division 7 or 8 times, and then you would play every other team twice. It's now you play your division teams 3 or 4, depending on the year. You play the opposite division in your conference 3 or 4, and then every team in the West you play twice. This alignment only makes sense if you wanted to go back to a division-heavy alignment. I have no qualms with that. If you wanted to do a division-heavy schedule where you play your division opponent 6 or 7 times as opposed to 3 or 4, sure. And then maybe this format makes a little bit more sense. But the way it is right now, on top of just being confusing, it is unfair. You are getting really good matchups too early in the postseason. All those years we wanted the Vegas-Colorado conference final, and it never happened. They always played each other in the second round because they were in opposite divisions, because one would be a wild card, and it's just this format stinks. It is unfair, and it is confusing for the average fan. I don't understand why we're still doing this.
Agreed. It is funny, when I do look at 1 versus 8, especially in the Eastern Conference, you would get the same matchups overall with this format right now that we have. For example, you would have Rangers Capitals to open round 1 versus 8, Hurricanes Islanders, Bruins Lightning, Florida Panthers versus Toronto Maple Leafs. All those matchups are what you're getting right now with the current playoff format, but it does change when you get to the Western Conference, for example. Sure, you have Dallas versus Vegas. That's easy. Vancouver, LA. But then you have Colorado, Nashville, Winnipeg versus Edmonton. Winnipeg-Edmonton would be a really fun series overall, but we're not going to get that because we're probably just going to get Edmonton versus LA or Edmonton versus Vegas. You usually get better matchups in the 1 versus 8 compared to the current playoff format that we have right now. Again, sure, the 1 versus 8 in the Eastern Conference is basically the same with the current playoff format right now, but it's just still a better format overall because it actually rewards regular season success. I keep seeing all these takes. Oh, we got to expand the playoffs, do this, do that. Oh, do you want to just degrade the regular season even more? I think half the league, Nick, is good enough for me when it comes to who gets into the Stanley Cup playoffs. I don't need almost 2/3 of the league getting in. Like, sure, a few years ago when you had the bubble with COVID-19 and you had the 24-team format, okay, that's good for, once in a lifetime, but I don't need anything close to that for quite a while. 16 teams is good enough for me, but please change the format at some point. And if you want to go full chaos mode, how about the top seeds pick who they want to play in the first round?
I still think, and this, I think there are too many teams in the league to begin with. 32, there aren't enough players for 30. There aren't enough good players to sustain 32 quality franchises. 16 teams making the playoffs is too many teams making the playoffs. We've spent the entire second segment of this episode lamenting how bad the team that gets that second wild card is. None of the Capitals, Penguins, Red Wings, Flyers, or Islanders has played convincingly good hockey. The only reason these teams are all still alive is because nobody else pulled away and because they all beat up on each other. That is not parity. That is a mediocre league. And that's kind of the issue here. The NHL says it's parity. It's not parity. It's that you have 7 or 8 great teams, and then everybody else beats up on each other, and then you have 5 or 6 god-awful teams. That's what keeps everybody close and the standings compressed. Not that there's this abundance of talent. There isn't. You know, you go through these lineups. You look at the bottom 6s of the Islanders, of the Capitals, of the Penguins, the Red Wings, the Flyers. Those bottom 6s stink. Those are bad forward groups in the bottom 6. You go to the second, third defensive pairs. Those are bad groups. You look at some of the goaltending situations in some of these places like Detroit, like Philadelphia. Those are not proven or good goaltenders. None of these teams really should be making the playoffs, in all honesty. There's a better argument that you should have that it should be the 16 best teams regardless of division and regardless of conference, because that would be more fair, you know. The Blues have probably played better than a lot of these teams down the stretch, and they deserve the opportunity to play in the postseason more than the Capitals do.
Oh, 100%. I mean, if you put the Blues in the Eastern Conference right now, Nick, you know, they have 89 points. They would basically be almost clinched when you look at the standings in the Eastern Conference right now. Everything you said about these teams are bang on. I don't expect any of these teams fighting for the last 2 playoff spots to win a round. I think if you're looking for a couple of teams that can give a couple of the top seeds some scares, for example, the Islanders, I think they could maybe scare the Hurricanes, but I still see that series going the way last year's series did, because I think Carolina is a bad matchup for the Islanders with the way they play. They play pretty similar to how the Islanders do, and they badly outplayed them last year. I know the Islanders have a new head coach now, but I still will favor the Hurricanes in that series. And then for if you get Penguins Rangers, for example, sure, I think the Penguins could give the Rangers a scare, and I don't think Rangers fans want to see Sidney Crosby in an opening round series just based on the way he's played the Rangers throughout his career. But do I expect the Penguins to win that series? No, I think the Rangers would probably win it in 6, you can maybe argue 7 games. And I would say the same thing for Washington. Heck, I think that series against Washington would be even quicker than if the Rangers would play the Penguins in the first round. I just think right now, whoever gets in, it just feels like it's going to be first round fodder for a couple of those top teams that get them, rather than, say, Tampa Bay playing Boston, Florida, etc.
I wholeheartedly and completely agree with you. That'll just about do it for this week's edition of the Locked On NHL Power Rankings. Make sure you are subscribed wherever you get your podcast. The Locked On NHL feed is every single day. If you are watching over on YouTube, make sure to subscribe, like the video, leave a comment. Let us know who you think is going to win that second wildcard spot in the Eastern Conference. We'll talk to you guys next week on the last day of the regular season.